So welcome to our speaker, Dr Emily Bryson, who will present a talk on debunking home dog poo composting myths. Emily completed her PhD in 2004, where her project was focused on composting dog poo in gardens. So Emily has a lot of interest in organic composting in a personal sense, in a garden sense, and in organic waste management. And she also has a lot of understanding about how dog owners are dealing with dog feces and understanding, what the major problems are in this area and what the solutions are. And this sort of fits into the whole concept of how we manage our waste, where dog poo being one of the issues that people have where they can't work out what to do with it. So Emily has a key role in the EPWN organisation. She helps people with pets to engage in issues of pet waste. And that's a terrific role to have because there are lots of people asking questions all the time. And we look forward to hearing all about her true and falses about home composting of dog poos. Welcome, Emily, Dr. Emily Bryson, and please tell us all about your interesting topic.
Cool. So yeah, thanks everyone for coming today. This is our first webinar of the year. So if you're in the future, like us in Australia, it's on Thursday, the 25th. So the 26th, but if you're back in the States, you're still on the 25th. Yeah, this is me. This is what I'll be talking about today. And just so you all know, we are recording today's session, and this is going to be on the EPWN website, the video. So I'm joining you today from Adelaide, South Australia. And to start off this webinar, I just wanted to acknowledge this place, Adelaide, as the traditional lands of the Kaurna people and pay my respect to their continuing connection to land, waters, and community. And I acknowledge the traditional owners of the many lands on which we meet on today as well, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. So no matter where we've come from today, in each of our communities, we live with dogs. And those dogs make lots of poo. In Australia, we have 6.4 million dogs. Multiply that by around 200 grams of poo per dog per day, and we're looking at 1,200 tons of dog poo produced every day, just in Australia. And we know that most of that is going to landfill. So I wanted to know if we could compost dog feces within households and use it in the same way that we compost and use other animal manures, even human feces, to grow food for human consumption. We know how to compost other animal manures for food production, so why not dog manure? There's lots and lots of misinformation and conflicting advice if you do Google searches and look on the internet for how to do this and where you can use it. But there's very, very little scientific evidence out there, which is why I did this research. So today I will be looking at some of the most common myths around pathogens in home composted dog poo. There is a big issue around plastic bags, but I'm dedicating a separate webinar to that one. So we'll send you a save the date, or you can have a look on the EPWN website for a save to date. That'll be in September, all about plastic bags in dog poo home compost. Since nobody had done a study of this kind before, I started out by conducting a survey of Australian dog owners to find out how they manage their dog feces within their households. I asked how they're home composting dog poo and where they use it within their gardens and what their main concerns were. As expected, they were very concerned about the potential health risks of dog fecal pathogens going into their edible gardens. Many participants said that they weren't putting dog poo in their home compost, but they wanted to. Just having a look here. Yep. That they wanted to if they had more information on how to do it safely. So I also used the survey data to design the compost trials that I did so that they reflected current dog owner practices. Okay. So the myths that I'm covering today are related to the issue that people are most concerned about when it comes to home composting with dog poo, which are pathogens. Just wanted to give you a bit of background on the pathogens that we're looking at. So these on the screen are some of the pathogens that can be found in dog poo. We've got bacteria, especially Salmonella and Campylobacter. They're often present in dog feces without the dog even showing signs of illness. Dogs can also carry and transmit pathogenic E. coli to people, including E. coli 0157, which is known for causing food poisoning. So just a note here with E. coli is a bacteria that is ubiquitous in the environment. So if you went and grabbed a handful of soil and had a look for E. coli, you're going to find it, whether there's poo in there or not. So there's lots of different types of E. coli. Most of them won't make you unwell. Some of them will. So E. coli is in most mammals' guts, so we would expect to see it. We have it in ours. We would expect to see it in dogs as well. And so they can have a type of E. coli that can cause illness to themselves and also humans. Soil-transmitted helminths are also commonly found in dog feces. These are types of gut parasites that can be transmitted through the soil. But some of these soil-transmitted helminths, such as Echinococcus, are not generally considered to be foodborne, so you wouldn't really worry about them getting onto your edible gardens. There's also protozoa in dog feces, like Isospora, but they're more of a concern for the dog. They're less of a risk for people. So I was interested in looking at pathogens in dog poo that could be transmitted to people through the composting process and through consumption of homegrown produce. And looking at that, I targeted pathogens that were shed in dog feces. They were zoonotic, which means that they can be transmitted to humans and make humans ill, that they were foodborne, and most often found in Australian dogs. So my research focused on Australia and owned dogs. And these pathogens may be different in remote communities or in shelter dogs and pound dogs, and also dogs that are living in developed countries. In order for someone to get sick from these bacteria, they need to ingest a minimum number of organisms. For each of, and I've listed those infective doses for each of my target pathogens in the table here. So just have a look at it, but just keep these numbers in mind because these infective doses are important when we start assessing whether composted dog poo can be safe to use in our fruit trees and veggie gardens. There are several ways that people can be exposed to pathogens from dog poo. The main ways are people just accidentally ingesting dog feces. And we can do that through the soil, through the groundwater, surfaces like tools, like composting mixers and shovels, also our hands. Then we can also accidentally ingest it through food grown in gardens where either the dog poo or composted dog poo has been applied. Most of the indirect exposure comes from mixing the compost, applying the compost to garden, irrigating the soil with a hose where the compost has been applied, and again, consuming those fruits and veggies that have been grown with dog fecal compost applied. The soil and the groundwater are important as well. Particularly after heavy rains or floods. So this is more of a risk when dog feces are buried in the ground and when compost bins or piles are actually touching the ground. So some studies have found that worms can aid, so composting worms can aid in the transmission of those fecal pathogens through the soil. And this is another concern with in-ground composting and vermicomposting of dog feces. So the first myth I wanted to just look at here is that dog poo home compost needs heat to kill pathogens. And this is a common assumption that dog feces shouldn't be composted on a home scale, as home composts rarely get hot enough for long enough to inactivate those pathogens. In industrial composting, where large volumes of organic waste are combined, the compost can get hot pretty easily and stay hot for days and sometimes even weeks. We generally consider composting materials that have been exposed to temperatures above 55 degrees Celsius for 3 days to be sanitized, because most of the pathogens of public health concern won't survive that temperature for that duration. But it's really, really difficult for home composts to get this hot and stay hot long enough to inactivate those pathogens. So when you have a look on the internet, you'll see that there's a lot of advice to people saying that if you're going to home compost your dog poo, it has to be hot composted. But hot composting it's very time intensive, it's labor intensive. You need a lot of materials to make it work well. And so this isn't really practical for most households. So in my research, I used smaller, more typical home composting methods like you would for food waste to see if they would be a more practical solution. And this graphic is an overview of the compost studies that I conducted. So essentially, I ran 2 pilot scale trials of dog poo mixed with sawdust. One was done for 7 months, and the second one was done for 15 months. And then after that, I did a larger scale trial using a compost tumbler, and I combined dog poo, food waste, sawdust. So I built that over 3 months, a little bit at a time, and then the whole thing composted for 9 months. So the total duration was a year. And at the end of all of these 3 trials, I tested the final composts for the target pathogens that I mentioned earlier. And I also tested the compost to see if it would meet the Australian quality standards for industrially produced compost. Before my research, there were no studies that investigated pathogen reduction in dog feces that were composted under real-world, outdoor, backyard-style conditions. So there is no evidence until the research I did to support the assumption that heat is required to inactivate those pathogens. In fact, there isn't a whole lot of data in the scientific literature on real-world home composting temperatures. But what does exist shows that home compost temperatures are generally not that much warmer than ambient temperatures. So I measured both compost and ambient temperatures every hour in my composting trials. And this graph is from the household scale trial, so the larger one, that had dog poo mixed with food waste. The green and the orange lines represent the compost containing dog poo, food waste, and sawdust. The purple line is the control bin that just had food waste and sawdust. You can see that the temperatures are higher than the outdoor ambient temperatures, which is the gray line, especially in that first 3 months. And that was when I was adding fresh materials about every week. Nothing more was added from day 0, and that's when the 9 months of the complete curing started. So you can see that the compost itself stays warmer than the ambient temperatures for about another 3 months. And then both the compost and ambient temperatures are similar toward the end. Most compost studies out there only measure temperature once a day and sometimes even once a week. So we don't have a whole lot of really good information about composting temperatures, and it's uncommon to see so much detail in how the temperatures progress. I love this graph because it shows how much both the compost and the ambient temperatures fluctuate over the course of the day and the weeks and also across seasons. So you can see that the temperatures in my household scale trial, they were the warmest of all the 3 trials that I did. And the highest recorded temperature was 52.5 degrees. None of the composts in my trials reached that 55 degrees Celsius, which is considered the minimum temperature needed for sanitizing pathogens. But when I tested the final composts for pathogens, the second pilot trial and the household scale trial were sanitized. They had no detectable concentrations of E. coli, Salmonella, Campylobacter, or the dog intestinal helminth eggs. These two trials met the Australian compost quality standards for sanitation, which states that E. coli should be less than 100 most probable number per gram, and no Salmonella should be detected in 25 grams of compost. And this all happened even though they didn't get hot composted. This was such a great outcome, but how did it happen? So what I found was that compost stability was the main factor in how well pathogens from dog feces were reduced to the safe levels under real-world home composting conditions. I used the something called the Solvita index to measure stability, compost stability. According to this test, composts with an index of 5 are still actively decomposing, but they're still heading toward that stable range. An index of 6 and above are considered stable. You can see that in that first pilot trial, I had too much sawdust in, well, you can't see, but I did. In the first pilot trial, I had too much sawdust in proportion to the dog poo, and it processed for 7 months. So the stability indices for these composts were between 5 and 5.5, indicating that the compost was still kind of active and not yet stable. In the second pilot trial, I tripled the amount of dog poo compared to the first trial in order to improve that initial ratio. This trial processed for a little more than twice the time of the first one, and most of the composts were considered stable, with that Solvita indices between 6 and 7. Only one of those compost bins had an index of 5.5, but it was still sanitized. In the household trial, the complete batches of compost that were processed for 9 months, and the whole thing went for a year. So the stability indices for that one were between 6 and 7, which indicates stable composts all around. So the connection between stability and pathogen sanitation, I found it actually makes sense scientifically. There's evidence to show that even industrial compost that meets that time and temperature requirement for sanitation can still contain pathogens, especially if that compost has not stabilized. Testing is always recommended to confirm whether compost has safe levels of pathogens present, but it's not practical or affordable for most people composting at home to send their compost to a lab for testing. What we can do, though, is test how stable our compost is, our home compost is. And based on my research findings, this can be a pretty reliable indicator of how sanitized it is. As I mentioned before, I use this Solvita stability test. It's actually marketed as a maturity test, but it measures stability rather than maturity. You can purchase these kits online, and they don't require any special equipment. It works by using these gels that change color, and that indicates how much carbon dioxide and ammonia the composting microorganisms are producing. It's not as precise as a lab test for stability or sanitation, but it is a useful tool for people composting at a household or a community scale. So another myth I wanted to look at was the myth that burying dog poo in the ground is the same as composting it. A lot of the commercial products for composting, home composting dog poo are these burial style products. And I think I mentioned it earlier that there's issues with pathogens spreading in soil, particularly when you've got heavy rains and floods, things like that. But I think that the bigger issue here is understanding burial versus composting. Composting is generally considered to be natural, But I think it's important to know that decomposition is a natural process, but composting is a controlled process. So when you're putting together materials in different ratios and you're monitoring it and you're making sure it's stable, that's you being in control of the compost. It's not the same with burial, where we can't control those types of things as much. Composting is naturally an aerobic process. It uses oxygen, and burying dog poo or dog poo with food waste in the soil, it actually becomes more anaerobic. And so that actually can create methane and some other greenhouse gases that we don't want. It's important also to think about the nutrients in the dog poo itself. One of the reasons that we pick it up off the ground is because the dog poo has nutrients that are not available to plants yet. And so if we keep that in the soil before they've broken down, then that can actually leach into the groundwater, and it can cause more problems than benefits, both to plants and to the soil. So we want to make sure that the nutrients in dog poo have broken down fully before we apply it to the soil. In my research, I used bins that were all enclosed. So I think that's an important thing to consider if you want to try this at home. And there have been some other studies on dog poo composting, not necessarily home composting, that have used piles, and I'll look at a couple of those in a minute. So this is a couple of examples of the types of dog poo burial products that you can buy at places like Bunnings or hardware stores, things like that. So it's really important to think about the science behind it when you're looking at what type of composting system you want to go with. And I would recommend doing something that's enclosed and above the ground. Another myth I wanted to look at is that compost worms and the microbial amendments like effective microorganisms, that they can help reduce pathogens. So these treatments, again, are commonly found in commercial products for home composting, but do they work, and are they even necessary? So my pilot scale studies were the first that I could find that tested the commercial microbial amendments in dog poo home composting. When I did my trials, I used something called EnsoPet, which is made by Bokashi, and it's a sawdust that's inoculated with a group of microorganisms. But actually haven't found any other studies out there on this type of product. So in the two trials that I did, the pilot trials, we can see that the effective microorganisms, so that's the EM in that chart, it didn't actually appear to improve the pathogen reduction compared to the control compost. And one reason that might be is that the microbial amendments in these products, they tend to use anaerobic microorganisms, which are not very effective for anaerobic composting process. So this is something that we just don't have enough information on, and we need to do more research to really understand if these are useful and if they're worth using. I also, in my pilot trials, used Eisenia fetida worms as a treatment. These are what we would typically think of as composting worms. So they help decompose manure and other types of organic waste. So in my trials, the worms survived the first trial when those composting temperatures were a bit lower, but they died in the second trial early on. There was a heat wave early on, so they didn't actually survive to the end of the composting 15 months. And this is something to consider if you're going to try and use worms. So whether you use worms and when you add the worms in, because worms are quite sensitive to temperatures, both heat and cold. So again, we don't really know how well they might be helping the composting process. In my study here, the VM is the worm treatment. So we can see, at least in that first pilot trial, that the worms appeared to have some effect in the first pilot trial, but the pathogenic E. coli that I looked for was still present. And the E. coli levels in the compost with the worms were still too high to be safe for use. There's a couple of other studies out there using worms to compost dog poo. Not home composting, but they did use them. So this here is a vermicomposting study from Poland, where dog feces were mixed with grass clippings and tree prunings in piles within an outdoor dog park. The compost piles A1 through A5, those were all combined into a single batch and composted. And then the composting piles B1 through B5, they actually had fresh material added every 2 to 4 weeks. So one was kind of like my pilot trials, and the other one was a little bit more like my household trial. It's important to know that salmonella was present in both of the piles at the start. So one of the things about this study is that both piles used worms. So they didn't have a control pile that didn't use worms. So we don't know what effect, if any, the worms would have had on reducing the concentrations of bacteria. They did test for those soil transmitted helminths at the end of the composting trial, and they didn't recover any eggs, any intestinal eggs, but they didn't test the dog poo at the start. So we don't know if there were eggs in the dog poo at the beginning, so we don't know if the worms helped to inactivate those. So there's 3 important things to think about in this study. The concentration of E. coli in both of the compost piles after 29 weeks were still within that infective dose range. And there was a very wide range in the concentration of E. coli in the pile that had dog poo and green waste added every 2 to 4 weeks. So that was the B piles. Some piles were quite low and others quite high in E. coli. That could be a sampling issue. We don't know, but it is something to be aware of. Also important to mention is that after nearly a year, both of those piles did have safe levels of E. coli. Just looking at this table, it illustrates why burying dog poo in the ground is probably not a good idea. And I'll just go through one more, which is a vermicomposting study from the Czech Republic, where different types of animal manures, including dog feces, were mixed with cornmeal and grass clippings and composted with worms in 400-liter boxes outside. So some things to note here are that in this study, fresh pig and cow manure had E. coli concentrations 100 and 1,000 times greater than fresh dog poo. So I think that's also another sort of assumption, is that dog poo has so much more E. coli than other animal manures. It's not always the case. And in the study, they looked at, well, what they found was that while the E. coli reduced in the other animal manures through that vermicomposting process, the levels of E. coli and dog poo did not reduce from the initial concentration, even after 9 months. And they didn't keep adding everything. It was just a batch. So the authors said that they didn't find any Campylobacter or Salmonella in either the initial manures or in the vermicompost after the fact. So again, this study didn't use a compost control box without the worms, so it's still really unclear to what extent worms may or may not be able to help reduce pathogens in dog poo. Another myth that is pretty common out there is that you should never use home composted dog poo on or near edible plants. And this one goes back to the myth about heat being necessary to kill pathogens. Dog owners are often told that they either shouldn't include dog poo in home compost systems, and if they do, make sure that it's hot composted. And then if it's not, don't use the compost on or near edible plants. So based on my composting trials, which I've shown you, the transmission of pathogens from well composted stable dog feces to people via handling or compost or consuming food grown in compost is pretty unlikely. So yeah, I've talked about pathogens already. My research, this is looking at the household trial. Going back to the data here, I'm just having a look. Yes. Talked about pathogens already, but I also wanted to mention that dog poo, home composted dog poo can be sanitized, but it can also make good quality compost. So again, this is my household trial. This one was interesting because I did have a control bin that just had food waste and sawdust without dog poo. And in the trial that did have dog poo, I blended the dog poo, food waste, and sawdust roughly in equal proportions. What I wanted to show you here was the plant growth tests at the end of the trial. So this is what they call a root elongation test, and they measure the length of the roots of seedlings. So in this trial, it shows that the composts that contained dog poo, not only did they exceed the Australian standards minimum of 60 millimeters of growth, which is great, but the compost that didn't have dog poo, that just had food waste and sawdust, didn't meet the standard. So I thought that was a bit odd. It was a bit unexpected. So I don't know why, but it would be interesting to see what future studies that test dog poo and food waste might find. But this data shows that, yeah, including dog poo with your food waste into a single compost might actually be more beneficial to plants than just using food waste. So yeah, look, the assumption that home composted dog poo shouldn't be used on or near edible plants is not supported with scientific evidence. That said, this is still an emerging research topic, and there are some limitations of my research and other studies. For one thing, I only tested my target pathogens, as they're the most commonly ones found in dogs in Australia, and they can be transmitted to people through food and food gardening. I didn't find any intestinal worm eggs in the dog poo that I used or the compost in my research trials. And that's likely because the dogs that I collected the poo from went to dog daycares, and it's highly likely that they've been given the deworming treatments pretty regularly. If eggs are present in dog poo and they're viable, we still don't know how the home composting process might inactivate them. And also that while the stable composts in my research had no detectable pathogens, we don't know how dog poo compost containing them might contaminate plants grown for food. So these are still some unknowns that we need to work on. So until we know more about these, I recommend the following mitigation strategies that are based on the most current scientific evidence. The first thing that we can do is prevention. So this is looking at things that we can do with our dogs to help prevent pathogens being present in dog feces and getting into our compost. First thing I would say is to deworm your dogs. I'm an environmental scientist, so I'm not a veterinarian. I'm not going to advise you on what drugs to use, how often to administer it. That's between you and your veterinarian. I would say, based on the evidence, it's important to avoid composting dog feces from puppies that are less than a year old. Those dogs that are quite young often contain more pathogens in their feces from their mom. They have lower immune systems, so they're more likely to contain those soil-transmitted helminth eggs in their feces. So just wait for your dog to be a little older before you start composting their dog poo. That'll help with some preventing some pathogens. Also, I would say avoid composting feces from dogs that have been fed raw meat diets. This was not something that I tested within my research, but there is some really, really good evidence out there showing that dogs that are fed raw meat as the main portion of their diet, that meat, it hasn't been cooked. So oftentimes it contains pathogens, both bacteria and intestinal worm eggs that can be transmitted to the dog. And those bacteria and eggs can also still be present in their poo after the fact. So if you just stick to the commercial diets and cooked food, then again, that's going to be a good preventative measure. Yeah, and it's going to help, doing this is going to help reduce the indirect exposures. So there's some compost related strategies as well. So these are some of the things that dog owners can do to help prevent pathogen transmission during the composting process. So we've talked about this before. So the first thing is to really avoid using those in-ground composting methods. So we don't want the nutrients or the pathogens to leach into the soil or to the groundwater. So if you're going to do it, don't bury it. Use an above ground composting bin. So tumbler, if you're using a bin that sits on the ground, make sure it has a base. Based on my research, yeah, I would say that only apply stable composts to your edible gardens if it contains dog feces. So we've talked about that already. And then with the worms, we don't really have enough literature to show that vermicomposting alone is effective for reducing pathogens. And we do have studies showing that worms can transmit the pathogens through soil. So I would be cautious when using worms as your only treatment. So follow those composting recommendations, whether or not you're using worms. So make sure it's stable. And that's going to help reduce these types of transmissions. So when it comes to people, what can we do to help protect ourselves from pathogen transmission? So really talking about basic hygiene things. So use your gloves. So gardening gloves, whatever you've got. Use gloves when you're handling the dog poo, picking it up, putting it into a compost, or when you're mixing compost, things like that, use gloves. Wash your hands, soap and water. So very effective. Wash all of if you're going to apply dog poo compost to your gardens that's growing food, wash your produce before you eat it. So that's going to help to rinse off any bacteria or eggs that might be present. It's best practice here. And look, follow any sort of general recommendations about handling compost that even doesn't contain dog poo. So wearing a mask, things like that, wearing gloves. So look, in a nutshell, my research, it found that dog poo from dogs that are dewormed and composted in an enclosed bin for long enough to become stable had no detectable pathogens and was considered safe for use on backyard food gardens. It didn't need to be hot composted. We didn't need those high temperatures. The typical outdoor home composting in a relatively small bin that seemed to be fine. So this was the first study of real world home composting with dog poo, which is it's pretty cool to be that person, but also yeah, it's also kind of daunting because there's still so much more that we need to know. We know that stable compost can be safe and actually beneficial for our home garden plants, which is great. Yeah, and so the ideal outcome from my research is that, yeah, in stable compost, it can be low risk. We know that stability in real world home composting environments is more important than the heat. So that's something to think about when you're looking at thinking about myths and assumptions. So yeah, I would say that if you're looking to get started, think about the recommendations that I've gone through, and yeah, give it a go. So I've got some published articles from my thesis that have all the dirty details on the things that I've talked about. And I just wanted to show you some of the papers that are already out there. These journal articles are free to read and share. They're open access, so you don't have to pay for them. And I'll just go through them quickly. So this particular paper is my literature review. So it was reviewing all the scientific information on dog poo home composting. So you can have a look at that one. This paper has all the details on the survey that I conducted of Australian dog owners and how they manage their dog poo in their households, including how they're doing home composting. This is the most recently published one, so it was just published last week. This looks at the composting processes, including the temperature and pH and things like that, and also all of the information on the final quality from all three of my research trials. And this paper looks at how home compostable plastic dog waste bags performed in my compost trials. So I'll be talking more about this research at the next webinar in September. Yeah, look, you can also download and read my thesis. So get into a comfy spot, grab some snacks. You can download this from my university's research repository. So pretty much if you just Google Emily Bryson CQU, you'll find my university profile. And if you scroll down that, you'll be able to get a link to my thesis. And then, yeah, you can have a look at it. There is a chapter in that thesis that's specifically on the pathogens. It hasn't been published yet, but it will be soon. So it's already been peer reviewed, and I've just heard back from the editor of the journal yesterday. There's a couple of minor, just like copy editing issues that I need to touch up, and then that should be published hopefully in the next week or so. So I will be sharing that with EPWN as well. So my papers are on the EPWN website, and when I get the pathogen paper published, that will I'll ask Rose to put that on the EPWN website as well. But for now, all the information on pathogens is in my thesis. Yeah, so the myths that I covered today are really just a few of the assumptions about dog poo home composting that I've seen and that my survey participants mentioned. You can see that I've mainly focused on the issues of pathogens because I think that's what people really want to know about first. And there's still a lot we don't know yet, but we now have the first scientific evidence showing that dog poo can be composted at home effectively and used safely in your backyard food gardens. So really hope that you all learned something new today and that it'll give you the confidence to try this at home. I would love to hear how your dog poo home composting projects are going, so feel free to stay in touch. Yeah, like I said, just search for Emily Bryson CQU and you'll find all my publications and my full thesis. Um, so thank you so much for listening to all of this, and for coming today. And for those of you who aren't today but registered and are going to watch the video later, yay! I'm glad that you're interested in this. This is my jam. So thank you. I'm going to end my slideshow now, and happy to answer any and all questions.
Emily, thank you so much for a fantastic seminar. It was excellent. You did a fabulous job of presenting a review of the topic, which covered all aspects that people could be interested in. And I think your experiments, as you say, are quite novel and contributed enormously to what we know about composting dog poo and the safety of dog poo. And then things like your experiments showing that worms didn't necessarily do things that's very interesting because people sort of associate composting with worms, which is is probably not a good necessary thing. And so I think that we probably have a lot of questions, and perhaps I'll start by asking if anyone wants to have any questions using the video, and otherwise I'll hand over to Fabiana to manage the questions in the chat column. So would anyone like to answer a question through the video?
Thank you, Lee. And yeah, just let me know if you can put if you can put it at the end of the chat window. I'll go in order.
Okay, great. Take it away.
Is that okay? We had some questions that came more like in the beginning. There's one from Sandy here. She asks, does it have to be ingested to cause human illness, or can contact with skin do it too?
Great question, Sandy. Okay, so with the dog fecal bacteria, we're really looking at ingestion for it to cause human illness. And that could be picking up your dog's poo with a bag or something, and that sort of like just grazing it. And then you're not washing your hands, and then somehow like biting your nail or something. So it's something as benign as that. With the intestinal worms, it really depends on the worm. So I looked at two different types of intestinal worms. I looked at like your generic dog hookworm, and I looked at a worm called Toxicara canis, because those are the two types of worms that are most commonly found in Australian dogs. There are other types of intestinal worms that it can cause illness through ingestion, but there are some that can infect you through skin contact. Those can be they're less common here in Australia, but in tropical regions, it might be an issue. So I think when it comes to food gardening, which is kind of really the main focus of my study, what I was really looking for were those parasites that could be in a bacteria that would be ingested. But at least from my study, we can pretty much assume that if your dogs are being wormed regularly, that is going to be your prevention there. So yeah, I think it really does help. It would be really good to have some more studies on different types of intestinal worms to see what's in there, and how composting might disinfect that. But yeah, we don't know yet.
Thank you, Emily. There's another question from Ruth Miller. What is the cost of the Solvita test kit?
Good question, Ruth. Okay. I don't know at the moment. So I purchased my kit from it's made by Woods in Laboratories, which is in the States, and I can't remember where. But they Woods End has different, I guess not dealers, but yeah, dealers. So subsidiaries. So I purchased mine from a place called Ag Insight, I believe that was it, online. And but if you do an internet search for Solvita Maturity Kit, you can have a look and see I think it was somewhere around $150. But honestly, I can't remember. And that was years ago. What you're going to get is you're going to get a box, and it's going to have 6 polycarbonate jars. And the jars are going to have a seal around it. And so you're also going to get 6 carbon dioxide probes and 6 ammonia probes. And so you're going to get a total of 6 tests. And so what you do is you take the jar, you take samples of your compost, and then you mix up your samples, so get a good representative sample, put that into the jar up to a line, chuck in your little probes, screw the lid on with the seal so that no air can get in and no air can escape, and then leave that for 4 hours. And then at the end of the 4 hours, you have a look at your 2 different probes, you compare it to the color charts they have, and then you can get a rough idea of how much carbon dioxide the microbes are producing and how much ammonia the microbes are producing. And then there's a little scale that you can use to sort of like get that index. The cool thing about that is that it really is made for field testing. So it's not something that you need a lab for. You don't have to plug anything in. You don't need any special training. Like I said, it's not as precise as a real lab test, but it is going to give you a good idea of where your compost is. And if you have a look, you do the test and it says, ooh, like I think my compost is sitting around a 4 or a 5. Then leave it a bit longer to stabilize, give it another month or another 3 months. You can run another test after that, see how it's doing.
And I think that Karen and also Ruth were able to look up the cost. And Karen
Cool.
says apparently a 6-pack is listed at $245 on the
Okay.
Solvita's website.
Yeah. That's 6-pack will get you 6 tests. So yeah, it's not cheap, but it is a lot cheaper than sending it out to a professional lab.
Wonderful. And another question from Ruth. With so much to learn still, what do you see as priorities for what research is needed next?
Yeah, look, that's an excellent question. I think that my research was really based on what's happening in Adelaide, so the Adelaide climate and dogs from daycares. So what I'd really like to see is lots of different climates. So I would like to see more research on home composting in places that get really cold and snow, tropical regions, things like that. So if we have more data from different places with different climates and slightly different composting practices, then we can compare it to the data I have, and we can get a much broader picture of what composting temperatures and stabilities and timing, things like that. So I think I would really like to do some more work with people composting in their homes and using sort of a set method, and then sort of using that method and spreading it out so that we can get lots of different people from different places. Yeah.
Very good. That was actually going to be my question too. If there's like a minimum and a maximum temperature, like an ambient temperature that we need to use. But I think what you're mentioning, correct me if I'm wrong, but we need, it would be nice to have more studies to see other zones also, right?
Yeah, it really would. And I mean, if you combine fresh organic waste, whether it's got manure in it or not, if you combine food waste with, shredded paper in enough volume, it's going to heat up. Because that's the nature of decomposition. So if you put an apple on the bench top, it's going to actually start to rot because we have microbes in that apple. So if you put enough together, then it will start to warm up because of microbial activity. And so the heat is actually coming from something being combined together, and microbes going, hooray, having a big disco. And so they get really hot and sweaty. And it's as the food sources start to decline that the microbes become less active. But there are different types of microorganisms throughout the different composting process. So it's the ones later on that are more fungal based, and more bacteria that act like fungi. So those are the ones that tend to want to break down the woody wastes a bit more. So it's really important to sort of have both, the heat at a certain point and also the cool at a certain point. But yeah, I was really pleasantly surprised that we didn't need those really hot temperatures in order to disinfect the pathogens.
That's fascinating, Emily. I'm
Yeah.
learning so much. So we're past the hour. We have a comment and a question. Are you still available for these two more?
Yeah.
And if anybody needs to jump out, this will be available on our website. There is a recording that will be available. And also Rose posted here the link to the resources page for Emily's work on our website. There is a comment from Dan Huff saying waiting 12 months seems like composting all the dog poo would require large above ground bins.
Yes. Okay. So this is where we get into a rotation system. So the pilot trial bins that I used were not very large at all. They were 25-liter water jugs that I cut some holes into, put on some mesh, and taped that. The other trial that I did, it was a 160-liter tumbler. So if you're building a compost, putting stuff in, like, say, every week, every couple days, then as you're building it, it's going to start decomposing and that volume is going to decrease. At some point, you need to say stop. And actually, I'm at that point right now in my compost bin where I'm like, no, I'll add one more. I'll add one more lot of food waste. No, you hit stop. And so when you hit stop, and you stop putting new stuff in it, you need to let that sit for, like I said, 9 to 12 months. The literature on home composting stability, the range of processing times after you hit stop for stability, there's not much, but they also say somewhere between 7 and 15 months. So yeah, but if we're talking about a year, what do you do next? And that's when you would start another one. So at some point, you'll need to know how long does it take you to fill up a bin, and then times that by how many months in the year, so you can have sort of a rotation going. So if it takes you 3 months to fill up a tumbler and you're going to let it sit for a year, you'll pretty much want 4 tumblers. Other thing you can do is just have smaller bins, and just label them with dates. So we don't need to have huge bins for this to work. Those 25-liter, water jugs are pretty cheap at the hardware store. So yeah, it doesn't need to be big.
Very good. Thank you. And one more question from Meloe. I'm sorry if I'm saying your name wrong, Meloe. They're curious about what sort of day-to-day your dogs that were used for testing had. Meaning, are there different levels of interaction in different types of environment that could impact the level of pathogens or at any given time?
Oh, yes, probably. Yeah. So look, dogs, when they go to dog parks, if there's dog poo on the ground that's been left there, and that dog poo is infected with some pathogens, and the dog walks through it, then their paws are touching it, and then they come home and they roll in, the carpet, and so they can continually, be exposed to that. So there's lots of environmental ways for dogs to be exposed to different types of pathogens and to bring it home and have us exposed to those types of pathogens. So I was only looking at fecal pathogens because I was only really looking at dog poo. And so I collected dog poo from dog daycares. And what I did was I gave them some buckets and I asked them to collect all the dog poo, over the course of a week. And then I picked it up, I mixed it all up, and I spread it out over my different compost bins. So before I spread it out, I took some samples. And then I collected all those, sent them to a lab for testing. And then early in my PhD, I did the testing myself. So I think it was really just capturing that moment in time for the dogs. So yeah, but we don't really know day to day what our dogs are getting up to. What I did assume was that since these were dogs from daycare, I assumed that they were healthy and not unwell. If your dog's vomiting or if your dog has diarrhea, don't compost the dog poo because you know that there's going to be a problem with that. So yeah, I think that it would be interesting to have a look at dogs from shelters who might not have been cared for as well and are under the care of a dog pound or a shelter or a rescue group, just to have a look at that sort of spectra and see what sort of pathogens are in there and have another look, sort of like comparing owned dogs versus non-owned dogs. Does that answer your question?
That's to Mike. I think it did, but Mike, if you didn't, if you have more, just let us know here in the chat. And he's also asking, did you ever encounter a dog that was sick? And I think you touched a little bit on this just now.
Yeah, early on, I was collecting from about 5 or 6 daycares, and in one pickup, there was some more liquid poo. And the person who handed over the bucket said that a couple of the dogs had diarrhea. So that was the only time that I, encountered that. I didn't actually collect anything directly from dogs. I did include my own dog Bailey's poo in, so I picked that up and mixed it in when I did collect the daycare poo. So yeah, that was the only time I really encountered that. When I sent the uncomposted fresh poo out for testing, I asked them to look for Salmonella, Campylobacter, E. coli, and and they were all present. So Campylobacter in a couple of instances, Salmonella mostly. So yeah, that's probably why it was there. I mean, dogs can have that in their guts and not show signs of illness, but that was the only time that that I knowingly knew that there was some diarrhea in the compost that I made.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Mike just commented, he said, I service a few municipal animal services facilities who have told more than once do not compost at times due to mass public infection.
I think it depends on what types of like what they're composting. So if it's like cow manure that's infected with, bovine encephalitis, I mean, that's something that we probably wouldn't want to compost. And it really depends on the commercial composting facilities and what their processes are like. I think we tend to think of industrial composting as one type of process, but there's lots of different ways to do it. And sometimes you're using open windrows, which is sort of like these V's that are cut into the ground. And so you sort of pile it up, and they have big machines that come through and they mix it up. And then they have sprayers come through and they add water. Other times it's flat on the ground and they have pipes coming in underneath the compost to aerate it while it's covered with plastic. And other times it's just a huge, like long cylinder where you put all the materials in there and it cooks. So those different types of processes are going to generate different levels of heat. They're going to generate different types of gases. So it really kind of depends on what pathogens you're looking for, what pathogens are known to be present in the materials that you're composting, and whether the composting technologies and processes are actually appropriate to deal with those. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see what your facilities are composting and what they're looking for. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Emily. There's one more comment that just came now from Alex. In the commercial industrial scene, a huge issue that comes along with different types of manures, mostly for grazing animals, is persistent herbicides. These baddies don't break down with the heat and won't do anyone's garden plants any favors. But pathogen kill-off is a part of good practice and is not difficult to achieve industrially.
Yeah. Yeah, look, when you're talking about compost quality, yeah, herbicides are a big one. They really are. It's not something that we typically are concerned about with dog poo. But what I will say, and this is another myth that wanted to go into, but just the timing, I cut it off. I will just briefly mention this, is that there is an assumption that dogs who've been wormed recently can have some of that deworming medication residue in their poo, and that drug residue can harm compost worms. So I did an ecotoxicology study on this as during my PhD. It didn't make it into my thesis. And what I looked at, and there were some limitations with the study. Big one was that it was during COVID and I was only using Bailey, my own dog. So essentially I gave him a worming tablet at the start of the month, and I looked at his poo. I collected his poo every 6 days through a 30-day cycle. And I fed that poo to different worms to see how well they grew and how well they survived. So I didn't see a clear effect on that. So in terms of herbicides and pesticides, it's less of a problem with dogs, but the deworming medication residue might be something that we do need to have a closer look at. So yeah, I haven't published it. I haven't written it up to be published, but it's still, I wasn't able to find a good clear answer. But yeah, I think that would be the thing that would be more relevant to dog poo.
Wonderful.
Thank you,
I think we
Emily.
reached. Oh, I was just going to say we reached the end of our questions, and thank you, Emily,
Yes, I think
for
we
sharing your knowledge. I will give it to Lee now to close our session.
thank you, Fabiana. And if anyone has any more questions, they could go through the EPWN site, and Emily, I'm sure, will be able to be pleased to address them. So I would just like to thank you so much for a great presentation, Emily, and your extensive knowledge of the topic is really very good, and your experiments too really provide a lot of insights into myths, and you have busted a lot of myths. And I just hope that you're able to continue your research in your current position. And from all of us, we wish you all the best, and that you're able to continue what you're doing, and also, having a public face to this so people can be informed about these important issues. So once again, thank you very much from all of us.
Thanks, Lee. It was such a pleasure to be able to talk about this to everyone. So thanks so much for registering and for coming and for watching the video. So yeah, thanks everyone, and thanks EPWN.